Stepping back a moment, I found it odd, somewhat amusing, puzzling, but in my work with Enneagram, basically anything that anyone could tell me was that I have a lot of 4, 5, and 6 in me. And so given that, you'd think maybe 5 is in the middle. So you could go both ways towards 4 or 6. So one way to resolve that would be to settle on 5. Now, based on that shaky ground, one of the next questions was then, given that greed is the deterioration and leadership is the movement forward, does that, where is the greed? That was my question. And I did not see the greed, which, added more muddle. I have been very non-materially interested. I've always had the ability to make significantly more money than I chose to make. So it didn't give me any pleasure to acquire things. And that's the stereotypical approach to viewing greed, that you want things, you want more money, more power. I often avoided power. I was not particularly addicted most of the time, or at least so it seemed. So there was the puzzle. Now, more recently, and with the guiding help of psilocybin, the psychoactive compound within mushrooms, I came to recognize greed. But it was a greed that I wasn't framed to look for. Rather, I felt it as an energy and then looked for how it played out. And the area that I'm incredibly greedy is around my attachment to having certain things go my way, to having certain things seen my way. I would say that's one of the biggest thing. I have just an incredible intolerance for people to see things the wrong way, i.e. differently than I do. And so in that sliver, right, in that sliver of perception and, I guess, mental architecture, I am incredibly greedy, meaning completely intolerant to other points of view, completely impatient, irritated, just incredibly reactive to people following a different point of view and arriving at a different perspective, and then doing things based on that perspective to such a degree that, I'll just dissociate instantly with someone that's going about things the wrong way and is going to end up seeing things in the wrong way and do the wrong thing. And so there's the thread of greed. Now, in investing, and what we're going to look at are some of the different corollaries, some of the geometric connections with greed. And the first one is easy. It comes from the financial world, and that is the incredibly close correlation between greed and fear. Greed and fear mark the two danger points in investing that best predict substantial financial losses, that best predict destruction and bankruptcy in investing. In other words, the more someone is governed by greed, the more they are governed by fear. The more someone is governed by greed, the more they will be governed by fear. Greed is the precursor to fear. Fear is the precursor to greed in this cycle. Right? So there's a close connection between greed and fear, and both are the best predictors of bankruptcy, of losing everything. Now, when we think of some of the archetypal expressions of greed, we see the dragon, right? Right, the dragon sitting on what? A pile of gold, right? So I guess my dragon looks even worse, half drawn. But anyway, the dragon sits on the pile of gold. And the thing about the dragon, as the archetype of greed, first of all, we've got the reptilian signal. So we've got the connection with the reptilian brain. Second, we have the image is of a dragon sleeping most of the time. You can think of Smaug in The Lord of the Rings, just sleeping there for decades, hoarding treasure and gold. And the thing that seems distinctive about that image is that the gold is never spent. The dragon never spends a penny of gold, right? Not a single one of an infinite number of coins actually gets spent and turned into wealth of some form, value of some form. And so the dragon hoards, but gets no benefit from the gold, right? So that's an interesting thing. As long as the dragon is there, as long as the reptilian brain is sitting on top and governing the resources, there's no joy, there's no pleasure, there's no value, there's no healing. There's nothing that emerges out of that trapped, guarded energy. So the reptilian brain guards the treasure but gets no value from it. Right? It doesn't turn it into theme parks for dragons or movies he'd like to or she'd like to watch. It's just a hoarding. And so the dragon traps the gold, but the gold traps the dragon. And so you have a prison dynamic between the reptilian brain, and the reptilian brain is governed primarily by fear. Fear is the law of survival. Fear and the fight, flight, freeze protocol is designed to meet the need in the hierarchy of human needs to survive. So we have fear that leads us to chase when we're frightened of going hungry, leads us to run when we're frightened of being consumed, leads us to freeze when neither of those seem to be expedient and conserve energy, play dead. It also leads us to ass lick the oppressor, because at a human level, we add another dimension with the rational sociopath, the rational reptile, that gauges who has the power, who's going to win, and curries favor, ass licks, right, for the purpose of protection. Right? I'll give my support to you, and then you'll protect me once you're elected. It's a nice theory. Didn't work out too well for some of Trump's supporters. But, you know, to the extent that they could be protected without in any way inconveniencing Trump, you know, they would get a little bit of, a little bit of support. But that's the relationship between an ass licker and a dominant power figure. Is I'll give support to who I think will win and take care of me in exchange for protection. But other than that, upgrade in the human reptile or the rational sociopath, we just have fight, flight, and freeze. The human adds please, so fight, flight, freeze, and please the power figure, which is done out of fear. If I don't please the power structure and the power structure takes office, right, as Trump busily prepares his next revenge list, then the power figure will punish me for not appeasing them in their hour of need, right? And so you have that dynamic. So fight, flight, freeze, and please. Now, greed is I would say, a natural fallout of fear, because if you're running in fear, the primary belief system, the primary experience is scarcity. Because if you want to survive and surviving is easy, you don't have fear. If you want sex and sex is easy, you don't have fear of rejection, fear of shame, fear of not getting enough. If money is desired to survive, to get rank, if power is easily available, there's no fear. And when there's no fear, there's no greed. But when there is fear, the fear is that there's not enough, that I will not survive, that I won't get any, that there's not enough for me. And so that fear, to the extent that we go down into that fear, is to the extent that we are motivated to get more and to get more, because it makes sense that if you believe that there isn't enough, that you need more and more. And if you believe there isn't enough, then there's no amount that you could get that would feel like enough. Because if your belief, if your foundation for your fear is, I'm not good enough and I'm never going to get enough, that fear creates anxiety and a feeling of not enoughness emotionally and physiologically, regardless of how much you have, right? Because as soon as you have enough, then you're going to lose it, right? Because I'm not enough, there isn't enough, I'm going to lose it, someone's going to take it away from me, right? And so the fear, right, you have the belief. Now, down here, you have this other circle, which, right, which is, right, the belief there isn't enough and the experience of reality there isn't enough. You have the experience of reality there isn't enough, and you have the belief there isn't enough. I'm less interested in that, the beginning and ending of that loop, than Lazaris is. And what I mean by that is Lazaris would say the belief comes first and the reality comes second. But human experience says that, you know, children that received an enormous amount of love and safety and security feel pretty secure and have a belief that there's enough and the world's a pretty good place. and that people who were severely traumatized, maltreated, didn't have enough food, didn't have enough money, were constantly shamed for not having enough food and enough money, that the belief comes second, right? Now, you can step out of the conscious experience that we all share and invent, another time zone where you could say, well, you chose to come in to explore that belief, and because you chose that situation, that the belief came first, right? But that's at some level, I don't think it matters, right? You can just say that reality of scarcity creates a belief in scarcity, right? You may start out as a 2-year-old expecting to be loved and cared about, and by the time you've been beaten up a few times by your older brother, ignored by your parents, shouted at for crying when they're on the road trip, and by the time you've been beaten down a few hundred times, that morphs from the entitlement of the world is going to love me to I don't know what's going to happen, but it sure seems like there isn't enough love, right? And I think that's a much more relatable. Human experience to say that as a result of this, and this, I never experienced having enough of this. And rather than feeling crazy, rather than going crazy and talking about how much of all this there is, I developed an expectation, an imagination, a story that said there isn't enough. And that story was a more accurate predictor of what was likely to happen day to day in my life. It was a more, accurate explanation of what had happened in my life than anything else I could think of. And so that's the story that I had. And I do think that if we understand that words are just constructs, they're not real, and they invent ideas that are not real, but they correlate to some extent with certain patterns. To some extent, they create the pattern, and to some extent, they correlate with the pattern. There is a phenomena of starvation, right? When there is not food in the whole village and half the population dies. And that phenomena can be correlated to the words, there is not enough food for half the population, and there isn't enough food for the other half of the population to feel safe and nourished, right? And those are useful correlations if you want to make a distinction between that town and another town that is going obese because everyone is eating too many carbohydrate, sugar, and dairy products and using food to process emotional literacy and a lot of shame that is not being dealt with. And it's a useful story. It's not true on some level. Right? Food doesn't exist unless you create the language of it. Half doesn't exist unless you create the language for it. It's an illusion at some level, but at another level, it's a useful illusion. If you're trying to take some of the obesity from this town and end some of the hunger in this town, it's a useful story. It's a useful set of illusions. I don't find it very practical to say that that over in this town they believed that they had enough food and over in this town they didn't. And that's why when there was a drought, this town went hungry, and that's why when there wasn't a drought or when there was good trucking service, this town is obese. it's much easier to track in time. If you take a town that is obese and take away all their food, and then notice what they think in 3 years if they're not dead, it's much easier to track that the belief that there isn't enough food came when a lot of people started experiencing scarcity in food, and the belief that there was lots of food correlated and emerged to there being lots of food. I think there are situations where the one creates the other, and there are other situations where the other creates the one, right? You have stock market crashes where everyone thinks it's going to crash, and so everyone leaves the market. And so the action of everyone leaving the market collapses the market, and then everyone agrees there has been a crash. But the belief that there isn't going to be enough food doesn't generally emerge out of nowhere. I mean, normally there has to be, something going on, such as all the ships with food have been sunk, right? So we're going to run out in a month. And then the belief there isn't enough food, can then lead to supermarket runs, and then there's less food. So there's some correlation there, but I don't think there is a case for one or making the other. I think it's just useful to see, that reality affects belief and belief affects reality. And so scarcity in beliefs often correlate with scarcities in reality. And there are ways, right? There are ways that, you can organize a set of actions that creates scarcity, and you can organize a set of actions that creates wealth. And in order to orchestrate the set of actions that create wealth, you need to be able to, believe in the possibility of wealth, particularly in a scarce dynamic. You've got to be able to overcome the fear and the awareness of the present moment, and create wealth in the future, right? And if you can't do that, and you start believing so much in the scarcity and hopelessness of the future, like a city dying, where everyone leaves the city because they all know it's hopeless, and pretty soon the people that remain find it pretty hard, right? The baker isn't gone, the baker has left, the dentist has left, the doctor has left. And so you can also see, the opposite, right? Let's say that 99% of the people say this city is dead, we're going to leave. So 99% of the people leave, and 1% of the city said, nah, hogwash. We're not going to believe that rubbish. This city is going to be a thriving city, and so they stay. Well, what would be the consequence, right? Well, their real estate values go to almost nothing. The first people who left the city could sell for market price, but nobody wants to be part of a dying city where only 1% of the population is left, right? So the first thing is their property values go down, and they probably can't sell for anything. The second thing is, doing all their normal things becomes quite difficult, going to the dentist when there's no dentist, growing their own food, and so you could say, well, wait a minute, they were the positive optimists that didn't believe that rubbish, right? They were positive, and now they are punished. But the people who were the first ones to be negative, they got full price for their property and happily live in another city with dentists and fresh bread. Well, is that good metaphysics, right? And that's why I say it doesn't matter at some level whether reality creates the belief or the belief creates reality, as much as it is to understand that cycles occur where reality does create belief and belief does create reality, and there's a link there. And the belief in scarcity creates a reality of scarcity, and a belief and a scarce reality creates a belief in scarcity, right? And so how do you get off of that cycle into another cycle, right? If you're spiraling down, how do you get to another spiral and spiral up in the opposite direction, going through reality and belief, right? Because, you know, and what moves the needle? Because one of the things, like you can see it with Bitcoin, where for a long time, all of the established players, in fact, you can see it with Tesla as well, Bitcoin and Tesla, Buffett and Munger, rat's poison, right? And a lot of people listen to Buffett and Munger, right? Not listening to Munger anymore because he's dead, but a lot of people listen to Buffett and Munger, and you know, they rat's poison, right? You know, scam. You know, it's going to end in a bad way. Well, if everyone believes that and doesn't invest in Bitcoin and Tesla, then they both go bankrupt. You know, Bitcoin goes to zero. That's the prediction. And from Buffett and Munger, Tesla, and you know, goes to zero, goes bankrupt, and you know, and so Tesla became the biggest shorted stock in Wall Street history. You know, Bill Gates, you know, trying to improve the environment, whatever, shorted Tesla and lost billions of dollars when the stock went up. And you know, so, but that's based on a belief, and then there's the bulls, right? That they believe that it's going to go up, right? That this is the future. It's going to keep going up. And you could say that in the stock market, it's whoever believes it the most wins. But it has to correlate with underlying reality. You can't have hype go too far ahead of fundamentals, you know, or it eventually collapses suddenly. And you can't have doubt go too far, you know, into absurdity. Right? Gordon Johnson, the great Tesla bear, you know, has been predicting that Tesla will go to zero or $10 or whatever, you know, any day now for, you know, for more than 10 years. So, you know, and as less and less people said that, right, he's the only one they can get on to create controversy, right? Because most people, you know, feel embarrassed, you know, at this point to say, gee, we lost all this money shorting, now we're wrong. And, you know, and all the banks that said Bitcoin poo-poo, you know, they're all jumping on board now. And so Bitcoin is going up, right? And if more people invest in Bitcoin, it'll go up some more. And so, you know, does reality create belief for those people that are joining on, the late adopters? Absolutely. They said it was all going to ruin. But there it is again. And then the other person said, oh, it'll be gone in no time. But there it is, and it's higher. You know, it's going to be gone in no time. Then they say, you know, we're tired of listening to you. You've been wrong year after year after year for 10 years, right? And look at all the money we could have made if we'd invested when Bitcoin was, you know, 2,000 rather than 60,000, right? We're not listening to it. Well, then they pivot the belief, invest money, and the valuation of a Bitcoin goes up, right? So is that belief creating reality? Is it reality creating belief, right? I would say that compelling narratives that correlate more strongly with reality eventually get more believers, Because if you can predict the future more accurately than someone else, you win. It's very efficient, right? If someone says, you know, if I believe this crystal will go up, it will. You know, if I believe it, it will go up. If I believe it, come on now, room of beliefs, this crystal will go up. Now, if you place 1,000 bets, keep going back to your room of belief, right? Come on. Be humble, because it's gone down many times, but, right? It doesn't mean it's going to go down this time. This time, well, be humble. This time the crystal could go up. Okay. Up, down, 50-50, right? Right. If you've got a better story for predicting the future, and you predict the future more accurately using that story, you can make a lot of money. And if you make a lot of money in a capitalist cult, you gain a lot of rank. Because it's not you they're measuring, it's your capital. So if you make a lot of money, your rank goes up, your capital goes up. You become important not because of you, but because you're connected to a lot of money, and the money in a capitalist cult is more important than the people who make it, right? So now you have a lot of rank. You've got a lot of money, and in a cult that will do things for money more than it will do things for people, you've got a lot of power, you've got a lot of money, you've got a lot of rank, you go up. And in that type of situation, the person with the story that best predicts the next outcome, which to a large extent has been science, meaning if you do tarot cards, or you do, will this crystal go up or down, physics is a stronger narrative for many, many things in life than metaphysics. Right? Metaphysics says what you believe or this and that, but if I want to make a bet, and I'm going to bet $100, is the crystal going to go up or is it going to go down? And I'm going to say, screw all that. Let's just look what's happened 99.9% of the time over the last, million years, as far as we can tell, and say that this crystal keeps falling. So I'm going to bet that it's going to fall, and I'll put $100 on that. Well, if I win that bet, and someone else is betting on, maybe it could be different this time. Maybe, right? Or some other story, right? Maybe every time Mercury's in retrograde, the crystal rises. Could be, right? It's a new age, it's a new this. And they keep losing money. And I keep making money because I'm betting on physics. And physics is a more accurate predictor of the future than this or that or the other. To the extent that that is the case, my wealth, my rank, my power rises, and their rank, their money, their power decreases. That's the way it works. The rational brain is a pattern analyzing brain that allows us to more accurately predict the future in more arenas than any animal can predict the future. Now, animals can predict the future in some areas. They can predict storms. They can predict things that we don't know how to do. But an animal can't predict the stock market's response to falling interest rates as well as a number of successful investors. An animal can't predict whether something will fall or rise, as successfully using physics, or what will happen when we're in outer space. So the rational brain, as a pattern analyzing brain, allows us to predict the future without having to test it. Meaning, after I've done this enough time and I've heard about the theory of gravity, which is all nonsense, it's just a theory, right? But after I've heard about that theory and I've watched things fall, they just keep falling every single, no matter what, they just keep falling. I can bet on that nonsense. And if that nonsense is more accurate than somebody else's nonsense, then I make money. I gain rank. And in a world where the fear of the unknown is the greatest of all human fears, and where fear controls 60% or more of all human action on the planet today, if I can show my competency in predicting and give people certainty rather than fear of the unknown, my rank goes up psychologically as well as financially and culturally, right? Because that guy said it and it happened. He can protect me from the unknown. He can protect me from my terror of the unknown, which is what being out of control is all about. As soon as I'm out of control, I could enter the unknown. And the unknown is neutral, which means half of the unknown is worse than the present moment by my guidelines, using my reference points, and half the unknown is better. But I don't know which one. All trauma, all PTSD, all horror lies in the unknown. Right? So does all joy, all bliss, all miracles, right? But which one will I get, right? So I don't think it matters whether we say that, no, the first thing that happened was the bad event, and then the belief that bad events happen came second, or the first thing that happened is the belief that there was a bad event, and then the event happened. The thing to notice is their loops, their patterns, right? Fearful thoughts create fear-based actions, which create fear-based realities, which create fearful thoughts. Although it is worth noting, that fearful thoughts also lead to countermeasures which reduce the likelihood of the fearful thought manifesting, right? In other words, if I'm afraid of a dark alley, and so I walk in a well-lit street and don't get mugged because of the fearful thought, right? That happens too. It's not very clean, is it? Right? We'd like a nice little tidy thing where if you think negatively, it always leads to a negative reality. But in some studies, constructive pessimism is the most successful human approach to the world. Bill Gates had watched Fortune 500 company after Fortune 500 company go bankrupt, get erased, get taken over by hostile forces and stock raided and all that. So Gates, and it also watched, Gates was determined to protect Microsoft from those tragedies that happened all the time in the business world. He was paranoid. He was absolutely, as Andy Grove said, only the paranoid survive, key figure in Intel. He was paranoid that Microsoft would be dominated by a hostile force. And as a result, he accumulated early on a $30 billion, it was called a war chest, but it was basically a $30 billion fund that could pay every employee's salary for a year with zero income. and the company would still be alive. It would allow it to defend itself in any hostile takeover in the stock market. It would allow it to hire the best lawyers and bully and dominate any threat to the company. You know, many, many times Microsoft has destroyed superior products because they didn't have $30 billion to defend and promote and advertise their superior product. And knowing that, they said, basically, you're going to give your software to us and get paid, or we're going to use our considerable resources to make your life so unprofitable and miserable that you'd wish you'd have sold it to us, right? So pure domination. And it worked very well. Meaning Microsoft did not, get taken over in a hostile way. The constructive pessimism begins with an expectation that things will go wrong, that there will be plenty of bad things that happen. And destructive pessimism says, oh, well, it's pointless to do anything because, well, what can you do about that? That's destructive pessimism, is giving up because you are aware of negative probabilities. But constructive pessimism means you work your ass off to see that those things don't happen while being paranoid that they could at any time. And they tend to get more done statistically than destructive optimists, constructive optimists, or destructive pessimists. So we've already talked about destructive pessimists, but a destructive optimist says that I've got a good feeling about this, things always go right. And so why look at the legal document? I'm sure it's in my interest. I'll just sign. Why look if the employees are embezzling money? They wouldn't do that to me, right? So the destructive optimist assumes that things are going to go well, and so why do anything at all, right? They'll just go well on their own, and when they don't, they're shocked, right? Because they're naive. And a constructive pessimist thinks things will go right and takes action to help things go right. But a constructive pessimist expects a lot of things to go wrong, looks at what they could be, and then works really hard to see that they don't, right? And so Gates is a constructive pessimist. And so that's, Elon Musk is also a constructive pessimist. He thought there was a 90% chance that SpaceX would fail. And so he knew he would have to work really, really hard and smart to give it a chance of maybe bringing it to 50-50. But it was worth the effort, right? Constructive pessimist. If it's worth doing against the odds. But understand the odds. I mean, don't just pretend that, an individual can become the biggest space company on Earth just because they want to, right? Understand all the different forces against that, but work your ass off to see that it might just happen. Now, if we come up here, right, we can see that the more fear there is, the more greed there is. Now, we can look at, so we can look below at the foundations of fear, but we can understand the more fear there is, the more greed there is. If you are afraid that your family may not be able to eat tonight, and somebody says, hey, could I borrow some money? No, right? There's more tightness. Greed could be considered a tightness. If you know that a hurricane is going to come and no one's going to be able to restock the shops, then everyone goes and gets more toilet paper than they want. That's what happened in the pandemic. So fear generates greed. Now, what's interesting is that a little bit of greed in response to fear seems to be constructive, but extreme greed seems to be destructive. One could say the same about fear. A little bit of fear seems to be constructive. Why lock your car door if you have zero fear and you create miracles? Why lock your house? Why take your wallet with you? Why not leave it in the open car seat, right? Why? If you have a little bit of fear, I think I'll lock the car doors. I think I'll lock the house, for that matter. I think I won't leave my credit card just laying on the table in a public place. I'll put a passcode on my phone. Why? For joy or for fear? Right? A little bit of fear seems to be more useful than no fear. People who are born without the physiological ability to feel pain do not have any fear of it. There are kids who can't feel physiological pain, and they love cutting themselves because it's so interesting. Right? Blood pouring out, this, adults rushing around, so interesting. They're not bothered by it. Their parents are. They're terrified because they understand that without the cue of pain, their kids can die very easily, and they will feel pain if the kid is dead, right? So a little bit of pain and a little bit of fear seems to be useful. And a little bit of greed. You've borrowed money 3 times, and if I keep loaning money to people who don't pay back loans, and I get a reputation for, I loan money to idiots, or I'm an idiot who loans money to crooks, if I get a reputation for that, I could lose everything. Right? So a little bit of greed, I'm not going to do that. And then in investing, the advice is be greedy when others are fearful, or be fearful when others are greedy, right? And so you have this underlying reality, which is generally going forward. That reality is always getting better on average. And then you have excessive bubbles that diverge so much from the reality that they create a return back to the mean, right? And so these are areas where greed creates the beginning of the bubble, then fear of missing out on the greed creates more of a bubble. Then greed creates more of a bubble. I want more, right? And then, right, fear of losing everything leads to selling everything, right? But no, it's going to get better. And then it goes down to here, right? And then, sell everything, right? Or often it'll dip below, before coming back, and you sell down here. Too much greed and too much fear, are a bit of a problem. But they're good in moderation. Anyone who has a passcode on their phone believes that fear is good in moderation, because the only reason to put that passcode there is fear. Right? Fear that someone will read this or that, fear that my phone will be stolen and quickly put into airplane mode, and it's based on fear. So what do we have the most fear around? Well, fear correlates with pain. We have the most fear where we have the most pain. The kids who are born without the ability to feel physiological pain have no fear of it because it produces no pain. The parents do, because it produces pain for the parents. We have the greatest fear at the greatest sources of pain. Now, the greatest sources of pain are traumatic pain, PTSD, and someone in traumatic levels of pain is terrified of endlessly remaining there, and to some extent in PTSD does endlessly remain there. And this creates the next movement, which is I will do anything imaginable to get out of that pain. I'm terrified because I'm in lots of pain, and I'm terrified the pain will continue. I will do anything imaginable to get out of the pain. Now, as soon as you will do everything imaginable to get out of the pain, you have an extreme attachment to whatever it is that releases and heals the pain. Right? And as soon as you have an extreme attachment to whatever it is that will release the pain, particularly if it is in an addictive cycle, where it's numbing or something of that nature, now you have insatiable greed, right? So if your greatest pain is a feeling of worthlessness, and because you have a lot of worthlessness, you have a lot of fear of worthlessness, then your greatest desire is going to be to get out of worthlessness. Now, if you live in a cult that values money more than people, and you feel worthless as a human being, but you feel valued as a person with money, then you will want to have as much money as possible. And there comes the addiction, right? The addiction comes because on some level, money doesn't determine worth, right? But you're in a cult where everyone says it does. And cults have groupthink, right? So everyone says it does, so you believe it also. Now you become addicted, you become greedy about money, because that's the only antidote that you found within your cult framework for getting out of the pain, the shame of worthlessness. Well, then you'll do stupid things. There's a natural rise and fall of the breath. There's a natural rise and fall of the sun. There's a natural rise and fall of the tide. But if you will do anything to keep going up when it's time to come down, you'll do stupid things. That's when greed diverges from reality. That's when a bubble forms. Right? That's when a bubble forms and you keep investing, fear of missing out. You keep investing all the way up the top, and then you hold on because you can't go down. You can't sell. You can't take your losses until it's too fucking painful down at the bottom, and then you sell, right? And so greed has to do with addiction. Greed has to do with fear. And of course, the dragon has to do with addiction, because the dragon is addicted to gold that it can't use and it can't spend. It can just stop other people from using it and spending it. It can make sure that no one else has it, right? And I think about addiction, I think about greed, and I think about my dog. My dog sits in the corner and ignores me most of the day, unless another dog wants to play with me. Well, then, come on over. You want to play? No. He's sitting in his corner. another dog is going to play. Another dog is going to have a good time. I'm going to have fun with another dog. Oh, he rushes over. He growls at the other dog, right? Until the other dog goes away, until I stop playing with the other dog. Then he goes back to his corner, right? He doesn't want to play with me. He wants to stop the other dog from playing with me. So you have the dynamic of fear and greed, right? And in relationships, in human relationships, plenty of women do the same thing, right? You want to get together, you want to hang out, you want to do this, you want to create something, you want to grow our love. I'm good. Okay, I'm going to go spend time with this other woman. Oh, how dare you? But you didn't want to do anything. Well, let me think about it. I've got some energy now, right? And so it comes out, the fear and the greed, the fear of loss, the greed holding on. And so if we look at, if we come back to my greed of things going differently than I want them to go, you could call that kind of the core greed. You could say, well, all the fear that I have relates to my biggest pain. So what's that biggest pain? Being shocked in a horribly traumatic state and being helpless and not knowing when it's going to happen and not knowing how long it's going to last. And everyone who I relied on in an authoritative role is causing the pain rather than helping me out of it, is humiliating me for being in the pain rather than helping me out of it. So the single biggest pain is being out of control in a traumatized state where everyone that could help me is hurting me and then humiliating me for the feelings, enjoying the feelings of helplessness as a way of transferring their shame of powerlessness to a young child. So what is it that I want more than anything else is to avoid that helpless state, right? And to avoid the shock, to avoid the surprise, to avoid the helplessness, to avoid being out of control. I want it more than anything. And that creates the greed, the addiction to having a plan, the addiction to being on the same page, the addiction to knowing what's going on, the addiction to having more and more and more of something, the addiction to having people see things my way, right? So the fear of the greatest pain becomes the greed of the perceived antidote. And it's never enough, because it doesn't fully address the terror and trauma of that young boy. The more I go above it, the more frantic I am that I'll be pulled back to it at some point. Life is good, right? But it could go back there at any time, right? And so it becomes a frantic, I want more and I want more control, right? And of course, much like a bubble, right? Romantic relationships can be a bubble then, right? Where it goes from I'm feeling out of control, I can't do this, I can't do, nobody's seeing, someone's seeing my way, someone's understanding this, okay, let's do more of this. But of course, it's not fun for somebody else. See, and this is where the fear and the belief that it's going to happen again, that I'll be drawn back into that horrific state, creates the frenzy, the greed to get more while I've got something, right? I saw this played out in one of my relationships where A woman did the same thing where I gave her more than she ever had of what she wanted, and the promise of slowly getting more. But the fear of losing it and missing out was so much that she just demanded, her response to getting more than she'd ever gotten before was not to enjoy and be grateful and give space, but was, I want it all and I want it now, which didn't feel good, of course. So I said, no, it's not, I didn't give you more than you've ever gotten before so that you could become more demanding and more controlling than you were before, right? I want the experience of enoughness, but you can't give that to me because it's rising above, right? It's rising above that core pattern, that inner child that's so desperately traumatized with PTSD hasn't gotten the news that there's more. So it's that hasn't been integrated. And so then the whole thing ends, right? If this is an endless pit, no matter what I give you, it's never enough. I'm not going to give you any more. It's no fun. Nada. Right? Oh, it feels so painful, right? To go back into that energy, right? And the same thing, right? Oh, this feels so good. Don't stop. I need to control this because it feels good and it's going to end at any point, right? And then someone starts to feel the clamp of my control, which of course isn't fun. And they pull back. And then I need to control some more, right? And then they say, oh gosh, I'm glad I pulled back, and pull back some more, right? And so there's that type of dynamic. Is that belief creating reality, or is it reality creating the belief? It's the reality of the unresolved PTSD in childhood that creates the insatiable need to transcend it without the skill to heal it, right? And so some thoughts on grief. The grief, of course, of all these addictions and fears running the show. Right. Addiction, fear, and greed cannot feel love. So there's no real anything in the whole pattern. Right. And when there is love mingled in with addiction, greed, and fear, the love gets trampled because greed and fear and the reptilian brain are so strong in their correlations with the survival need with our reptilian history. They're so strong in the cult, meaning the rational reptile is the primary operating system for most of humanity most of the time, right? And so when you diverge from the rational reptile into empathic or transcendent territory, which do have the capacity to love, the transcendent brain has the capacity for unconditional love, the empathic brain has the capacity for human love. But that human love is trumped by fear, is trumped by greed, right? And so when the rational reptile is the dominant operating system and the dominant force within the body, anytime it gets triggered, someone will act out of greed and fear, which is always not loving to them or to you, right? But it is what they will function with greed and fear. And it's, when that is the case, there's just a few people. Byron Katie, I think, seems to be one of them. There's just a few people in the world where greed and fear is not the dominant operating system most of the time. Thich Nhat Hanh, perhaps another one, right? So reflections on greed and fear. What did you learn? You can share in the comments below.